The candles on the long dining table had burned halfway down before Alara finally accepted that he was not coming. She sat alone at one end of the polished table, the empty chair at the other end catching the last light of evening. 12 chairs stood between them, all empty, all silent, arranged like a row of closed doors. The soup in front of her had gone cold an hour ago. A servant had quietly refilled her water twice, each time glancing at her with a pity she pretended not to notice. This was her life now. Not loud unhappiness, not shouting or slammed doors, but something quieter and in its own way harder to survive. A marriage built entirely of silence. 3 years earlier, Alara Whitmore had arrived at Ravenscroft Manor as a bride full of nervous hope. She had heard whispers about the Duke before the wedding that he was serious, that he kept to himself, that his heart had been broken once and had never fully healed. She had told herself that kindness and patience could soften any man, given enough time. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that love could be built slowly, the way a garden is built, one small act of care at a time. She had been wrong about how long that would take. She had not yet learned that some men do not simply need time. Some men have decided, quietly and completely, to feel nothing at all. Duke Alastair Ravenscroft sat in his study on the other side of the house, a stack of letters and ledgers spread across his desk, though he had not read a single line in the last 20 minutes. His eyes were fixed on the fire instead, watching the flames curl and fall the way they always did, the way they had done every night for years. He was not thinking about business. He rarely was in these quiet hours. He was thinking, as he often did without meaning to, about a woman named Vivienne who had died 6 years before he ever met Alara. Vivienne, who had laughed easily, who had loved him without conditions, who had been taken from him by illness before they could marry. He had built a wall after that, not out of cruelty but out of self-protection. He had convinced himself that if he never let himself feel deeply again, he could never be hurt that deeply again. He did not know that his wife was sitting alone at a table down the hall, growing colder with every passing minute, not from the temperature of the room, but from something far more painful. He did not know, because he had never really looked. The next morning, Alara rose before the sun, as she always did. She dressed simply, tied her hair back, and walked out into the garden that wrapped around the eastern side of the manor. This garden was the one place in Ravenscroft that truly belonged to her. When she had first arrived, it had been overgrown and neglected, roses choked by weeds, paths buried under fallen leaves. Nobody had cared for it in years. She had cared for it instead, quietly, patiently, the way she cared for everything that others overlooked. Now the garden bloomed. Roses climbed along the stone walls in deep red and soft pink. A small path wound between lavender bushes toward a wooden bench she had placed beneath an old oak tree. Bees moved lazily between flowers. Birds nested in the eaves of the old stone wall. It was, by any honest measure, one of the most beautiful gardens in the county. Alastair had walked past it 100 times on his way to inspect the stables. He had never once stopped to notice how it had changed. That morning, as Alara knelt beside a bed of white flowers, pulling weeds with practiced hands, one of the younger maids, a girl named Hannah, approached carrying a small basket of fresh bread. "You're up early again, Your Grace," Hannah said, setting the basket on the bench. "I sleep better with the sunrise than without it," Alara replied, offering a small smile. It was not entirely a joke. Hannah lingered a moment, glancing back toward the manor. "The staff were talking last night," she said carefully, "about the dinner. Nobody could understand why His Grace didn't come down." Alara brushed dirt from her hands and stood. "There's nothing to understand, Hannah. He was busy. He often is." "It isn't right, though," Hannah said, quieter now. "A wife shouldn't have to eat alone every night in her own home." Alara said nothing to that. There was nothing kind to say that would also be honest, so she chose silence instead, the same silence she had grown so skilled at wearing like a second dress. She had learned over 3 years that silence protected her better than words ever could. Words invited disappointment. Silence simply let her keep going. She spent the rest of the morning in the garden, and by midday, The ache in her chest had softened into something more familiar, something she had learned to carry without letting it show on her face. Later that week, a letter arrived from Lady Margaret Ashworth, Alastair's older sister, announcing her intention to visit Ravenscroft for a fortnight. Margaret was sharp-eyed and plain-spoken, unafraid to say what others only thought. She had never approved of how quiet the manor had become since Alastair's marriage, though she had said little about it directly, choosing instead to watch and wait. Alastair read the letter at his desk and felt, for the first time in weeks, something close to unease. Margaret noticed things. Margaret asked questions he did not want to answer. He set the letter aside and told himself it would be a simple visit, nothing more. He did not yet understand that some visits have a way of pulling loose the threads that have been quietly unraveling in a house for years, threads that no one had bothered to notice until someone finally pulled hard enough. That evening, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, Alastair appeared in the dining room before the meal had gone cold. He said little, offering only a brief greeting before taking his seat. Alara, startled by his presence, said even less, unsure whether this small change meant anything at all or whether it was simply another quiet evening dressed in a different shape. They ate largely in silence, the clink of silverware the only sound between them. Alastair glanced at her once, briefly, taking in the tired shadows beneath her eyes that he had somehow never noticed before. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, unsure what words might even belong in a silence this old. Alara noticed the glance. She had learned over the years to notice everything about him, even the smallest movements, because those small movements were often the only pieces of him she was given. She said nothing about it. She simply finished her meal, thanked him quietly for joining her, and retired to her room, where she sat by the window for a long while, watching the moon rise over the garden she had built with her own 2 hands. Somewhere in the house below, Alastair sat alone in his study once more, staring at the fire, feeling an unfamiliar restlessness he could not quite name. It was not love, not yet. It was something smaller than that, something more like the first crack in a wall that had stood, unquestioned, for far too long. Neither of them knew it then, but that quiet, ordinary evening was the beginning of an ending neither one of them had chosen, and neither one of them was ready for. Lady Margaret Ashworth arrived at Ravenscroft Manor exactly on schedule, stepping down from her carriage with the brisk energy of a woman who had never once in her life waited patiently for anything. She was tall, sharp-featured, and dressed in deep green traveling clothes that suited her sharp tongue perfectly. Within minutes of arriving, she had already noticed 3 things that troubled her. The first was that her brother looked thinner than he had the last time she visited. The second was that the household staff moved through the halls with a strange, careful quiet, as though tiptoeing around something unspoken. The third, and most troubling, was the look on Alara's face when she came to greet her. A look of practiced pleasantness stretched thin over something far more tired underneath. Margaret said nothing about any of it that first evening. She was patient when patience served her, and she had learned long ago that people revealed their true situations far more honestly when they believed no one was watching closely. Over the following days she watched. She watched Alastair disappear into his study each morning after breakfast and remain there until well past dark. She watched Alara rise early, work in her garden, oversee small matters of the household with quiet competence, and retire alone each night, her husband's chair at dinner empty more often than not. She watched the way the staff spoke to Alara with genuine warmth and affection, the kind that could not be commanded or purchased, only earned through years of small kindnesses. And she watched the way none of that warmth seemed to reach her brother at all. On the 4th evening of her visit, Margaret found Alastair in his study, as she had expected, hunched over papers he was clearly not reading. "You've hardly spoken 10 words to your wife since I arrived," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk without waiting to be invited. Alastair did not look up. "We speak when there is something to say." "And is there never anything to say? 3 years married, and you speak to her less than you speak to your own steward." Margaret! Don't Margaret me. She leaned forward, her voice losing its teasing edge. I walked through her garden this morning. Do you know what she's built out there? Roses that would win prizes at any county fair. A path she laid herself, stone by stone, with the help of 2 maids and nothing else. She turned that overgrown patch of dirt into something beautiful, Alistair, entirely on her own, because no one else in this house seemed to notice it needed tending. Just like no one seems to notice that she does. Alistair finally looked up, something flickering behind his eyes that he quickly smoothed away. She has everything she needs. A home, security, respect from the staff. She has everything except a husband, Margaret said flatly. You gave her a title and a house and nothing else. Do you have any idea how lonely that must be, to live inside a marriage that exists only on paper? The words landed harder than Margaret perhaps intended, and for a moment Alistair said nothing at all. He thought of Vivienne, as he so often did in quiet moments, and felt the familiar tightening in his chest that he had trained himself to endure by simply not feeling anything else too deeply. If he did not let himself feel much for Alara, he reasoned silently, he could never be hurt by losing her the way he had lost Vivienne. It was not cruelty. It had never been cruelty. It was fear, wearing the disguise of distance. But he did not say any of that to his sister. He had never said it to anyone. I appreciate your concern, he said instead, his voice carefully even, but my marriage is not a matter for discussion. Margaret studied him for a long moment, disappointment plain on her face. One day, she said quietly, rising from her chair, you are going to look up from this desk and realize the house has gone silent because she is no longer in it. And I promise you, brother, that silence will be far louder than anything you're avoiding right now. She left him alone with those words, and though he told himself he would not dwell on them, he found himself unable to focus on his papers for the rest of the evening. 2 days later, Margaret sought out Alara in the garden, finding her kneeling beside a bed of climbing roses, sleeves rolled to her elbows, dark soil beneath her fingernails. You have a gift for this, Margaret said, admiring the arch of blooming roses that framed the garden's entrance. I don't think I've ever seen this place look so alive. It gives me something to care for, Alara said simply, not looking up from her work. Something that grows because of the attention I give it. Margaret heard the quiet weight beneath those words and chose to sit on the wooden bench nearby rather than press further right away. She watched Alara work in comfortable silence for several minutes before speaking again. May I ask you something honestly, and you may tell me to mind my own affairs if you wish. Alara paused, sitting back on her heels. You may ask. Are you happy here? The question hung in the warm afternoon air between them. Alara's hands stilled over the soil. For a long moment she said nothing, and Margaret wondered if she had overstepped after all. I am content, Alara finally said. I have built a life here that I can be proud of, even if it is not the life I imagined when I first arrived. The garden, the staff, the small kindnesses I can offer to those around me. These things matter to me. I have learned to find happiness in what I have, rather than grieving what I do not. That is a very graceful answer, Margaret said gently, but it isn't quite the same as being happy. Alara's eyes met hers then, and for just a moment the careful composure she wore like armor slipped, revealing something rower underneath, something tired and lonely and quietly aching. No, she admitted softly. I suppose it isn't. Does he know how much this has cost you? He has never asked, Alara said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only a plain, weary honesty that somehow felt heavier than anger ever could. And I stopped offering the answer a long time ago, because offering it and being ignored hurt far more than simply keeping it to myself. Margaret reached over and gently took Alara's soil-stained hand in her own. You deserve more than this, she said. Whatever my brother's reasons for his distance, they are his to carry, not yours to suffer for. Alara said nothing, but she did not pull her hand away, and for a moment the 2 women simply sat together in the fragrant garden, surrounded by roses that Alara had grown from nothing, a quiet understanding passing between them that needed no further words. That evening, Margaret joined the couple for dinner and watched closely as the meal passed in its usual near silence. Alastair asked polite, distant questions about the estate. Alara answered them with practiced grace. Neither of them looked at the other for longer than a passing moment. Margaret's heart ached watching it, this careful choreography of two people sharing a table and nothing else. After dinner, as Alara excused herself to retire, Margaret caught her brother's arm before he could disappear back into his study. "Walk with her in the garden tomorrow," she said quietly. "Just once. See what she has built. See her, Alastair, really see her before it is too late to matter." Alastair opened his mouth to refuse, some old instinct rising up to protect the careful distance he had maintained for years. But something in his sister's expression, some rare seriousness he did not often see in her, stopped him. "Perhaps," he said instead, and though it was a small word, it was more than he had offered in longer than he could remember. The following morning, true to his half-promise, Alastair found himself standing at the edge of the garden as the sun rose over the eastern wall. He had not visited this part of the estate in years, had barely registered its existence beyond a passing glance from the window of his study. What he found stopped him entirely. Roses climbed in cascading waves of red and pink along every stone wall. Lavender bushes lined a carefully laid stone path, their fragrance rich in the morning air. Bees moved lazily from bloom to bloom, and somewhere nearby, birds called to one another from a nest tucked into the ivy along the old wall. It was, without question, one of the most beautiful things he had seen on his own property in years, and he had not known it existed until this very moment. Alara knelt near the far end of the garden, unaware of his presence, humming softly to herself as she worked. For a long moment, Alastair simply watched her, struck by something he could not immediately name. She looked in that quiet morning light, surrounded by everything she had built with her own hands, entirely at peace. It was a peace he realized with a small and uncomfortable jolt that he had never once given her himself. He stepped forward and a twig snapped beneath his boot. Alara looked up, startled, her expression shifting quickly from surprise to careful neutrality, the same practiced composure she wore for him always. "Your Grace," she said, rising and brushing dirt from her skirts, "I did not expect you out here." "I did not expect to come," he admitted, and it was perhaps the most honest sentence he had spoken to her in months. "This is remarkable, Alara, all of it. Did you do this yourself?" Something flickered across her face, surprise mixed with a cautious, guarded hope. "With help from the staff, yes. It was overgrown when I arrived. I thought it deserved better." "It's beautiful," he said simply and meant it. They stood together in silence for a long moment, neither quite certain what to say next after years of having so little practice speaking to one another honestly. It was not a grand reconciliation, not a sweeping declaration. It was only a small moment, a single crack of light through a door that had been closed for a very long time. But even small cracks, Alara would later reflect, have a way of letting in more than anyone expects, and even the smallest changes, once begun, rarely stay small for long. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, sealed in gold wax and addressed to both the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft. Lord and Lady Pembroke were hosting their annual autumn ball, an event that drew nearly every notable family within 100 miles, and attendance was, as it had always been, less a request than an expectation. Alastair read the invitation at his desk and felt an unfamiliar flicker of something close to reluctance. In years past, he would have sent his regrets without a second thought, citing estate business or ill health or any of a dozen convenient excuses. This year, for reasons he did not entirely examine, he found himself setting the invitation aside rather than immediately declining it. He thought of the garden. He thought of Alara kneeling among her roses, humming softly, entirely unaware of how completely he had failed to notice her for years. He thought of his sister's words, still lingering uncomfortably in the back of his mind. "One day you are going to look up from this desk and realize the house has gone silent because she is no longer in it." That evening, he found Alara in the small sitting room she favored, a book open in her lap though her eyes seemed fixed on something far beyond its pages. "The Pembrokes have invited us to their autumn ball," he said, standing somewhat awkwardly near the doorway. Alara looked up, surprise evident on her face. In 3 years of marriage, he had never once discussed a social invitation with her directly. Such matters had always simply been decided, or more often, simply ignored. "I assumed you would decline as always." "I thought," he said slowly, choosing his words with unusual care, "that perhaps we might attend together this year." The surprise on her face deepened, though she quickly smoothed it into something more neutral, a habit born of years spent protecting herself from hopes too easily disappointed. "If that is what you wish." "It is," he said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he meant it. The evening of the ball arrived with a crispness in the air that spoke of autumn settling fully into the countryside. Alara dressed in deep blue silk, a color she had chosen carefully, not for its flattery, though it flattered her considerably, but because it was a color she genuinely loved, the color of the sky just after sunset. She had not dressed with such quiet intention in longer than she could remember. When Alastair saw her descending the staircase, something in his chest tightened unexpectedly. He realized with a small and uncomfortable jolt, genuinely forgotten how striking his own wife could be when she was not simply moving quietly through the background of his days. It was not merely her appearance, though that alone was considerable. It was the quiet confidence in the way she carried herself, a confidence he suspected she had built entirely without his help, perhaps even in spite of his absence. "You look lovely," he said, and the words felt inadequate even as he spoke them. "Thank you," Alara replied, and for the first time in longer than either could measure, something like genuine warmth passed between them, small and fragile but unmistakably real. The Pembroke estate glittered with candlelight when they arrived, every window glowing warmly against the deepening evening sky. Carriages lined the long drive, and the sound of music and laughter drifted out to greet new arrivals. Alara took Alastair's offered arm as they entered, and if she was surprised by the gesture, she did not let it show. Inside, the ballroom was a swirl of color and movement, gowns of every shade catching the candlelight as couples moved through the steps of a lively dance. Lord Pembroke greeted them warmly at the entrance, expressing genuine surprise and pleasure at seeing the Duke attend with his wife for what he noted, with the bluntness of an old family friend, was the first time in recent memory. As the evening progressed, Alastair found himself watching Alara move through the crowd with an ease that startled him. She spoke warmly with acquaintances, laughed genuinely at shared jokes, offered kind words to shy young debutantes standing awkwardly at the edges of the room. She was, he realized, genuinely liked, genuinely respected, in ways he had simply never bothered to observe. "Your wife is remarkable," said Lady Pembroke, appearing at his side with a knowing smile. "She spent nearly an hour last spring helping organize the charity drive for the Eastern Parish Orphanage. Did she never mention it?" "No," Alastair admitted, a strange discomfort settling in his chest. "She did not." "She rarely speaks of her own good works," Lady Pembroke said, watching him carefully. "I've always found that the truest measure of kindness, the kind that asks for no recognition at all." Alastair said nothing, but the words settled deep, another small piece of a puzzle he was only now beginning to realize he had never bothered to assemble. Later in the evening, as the orchestra shifted into a slower, gentler piece, Alastair found himself approaching Alara where she stood near one of the tall windows, watching the dancers with quiet contentment. "Would you dance with me?" he asked, the question feeling strange and unfamiliar in his mouth, though not unwelcome. Alara turned, surprise flickering briefly across her features before she offered a small, genuine smile. "I would like that." They moved onto the floor together, and though neither of them had danced with the other in longer than either cared to admit, their steps fell into an easy rhythm, as though some part of them had simply been waiting for the opportunity to remember how. Alastair's hand rested at her waist, and he found himself acutely aware of her nearness, in a way he had not permitted himself to feel in years. "You've built quite a life for yourself," he said quietly as they turned slowly across the floor. "The garden, the charity work, the friendships you've clearly cultivated here tonight. I confess, I knew very little of any of it." "You were not often present to know," Alara said, though there was no sharpness in her voice, only a plain and weary honesty. "I did not build these things to be noticed, Alistair. I built them because I needed something of my own, something that could not be taken from me by silence." The words landed with unexpected weight, and Alistair felt something in his chest twist uncomfortably. "I am sorry," he said quietly, the admission costing him more than he expected. "I have not been the husband you deserved." Alara looked up at him, searching his face for something, perhaps sincerity, perhaps simply the courage to finally say such words aloud. "Why now?" she asked softly. "Why, after 3 years, are you saying this now?" He was quiet for a long moment, his steps slowing slightly as he considered his answer carefully. "Because my sister showed me a garden I had never noticed," he said finally. "Because I watched you tonight, laughing with people who clearly adore you, and realized I know almost nothing about the woman I married. Because I have spent years hiding from grief I never properly let go of, and in doing so I built walls that kept out far more than just pain. They kept out you as well." Alara's eyes glistened faintly in the candlelight, though she blinked the emotion back quickly, unwilling to let it fully surface in so public a setting. "That is the most honest thing you have ever said to me," she said quietly. "I know," he admitted. "I am sorry it took so long." They finished the dance in a silence that felt entirely different from the silences that had defined their marriage before, softer somehow, filled with the fragile beginnings of something neither of them dared to name too quickly. But even as the evening drew to its warm and hopeful close, a shadow moved quietly at the edges of the ballroom, one that neither Alistair nor Alara noticed in the glow of their small reconciliation. Lord Edmund Caro, a distant cousin of the Pembroke family, and a man known throughout the county for his sharp tongue and sharper ambitions, watched the Duke and Duchess dance together with narrowed, calculating eyes. He had heard the rumors of the Ravenscroft marriage, the cold distance, the quiet unhappiness whispered about in drawing rooms and card parties for years. He had, in fact, quietly cultivated his own interest in the Duchess's misfortune, hoping that a marriage so clearly strained might one day crack entirely, leaving an opening he intended to be perfectly positioned to fill. Watching them now, laughing softly together, moving with an ease he had not expected, Edmund felt a flicker of irritation he did not fully examine. He had waited patiently for years, gathering small pieces of information, cultivating a careful friendship with Alara built on sympathetic conversation and quiet understanding during those long, lonely months when her husband had been absent even while present. He had told himself his intentions were honorable, that he simply wished to offer comfort to a woman who deserved better than she received. He was not entirely certain, watching them now, that this was still true. He said nothing that evening, offering only a polite greeting to the Duke and Duchess as the ball wound toward its close, his expression carefully composed, revealing nothing of the calculations already turning quietly behind his eyes. On the carriage ride home, Alara sat close to Alistair, closer than she had in longer than she could remember, the warmth of the evening still lingering pleasantly between them. "Thank you," she said softly, "for tonight." "Thank you," he replied, "for still being willing to give me a chance after everything." She smiled, small and genuine, and rested her head briefly against his shoulder as the carriage rolled through the quiet, moonlit countryside toward home. It was a small gesture, simple and unremarkable to any outside observer, but to both of them it felt like the first true step across a distance that had stood between them for far too long. Neither of them noticed, in that quiet and hopeful moment, the careful attention Lord Edmund Caro had paid them throughout the evening, nor the quiet plans already forming behind his composed and pleasant smile. The road ahead, though it had finally begun to soften with warmth and possibility, was not yet free of shadows, and the fragile beginning they had built that evening would soon be tested in ways neither of them could have anticipated. In the weeks that followed the Pembroke ball, something at Ravenscroft Manor began, quietly and cautiously, to change. Alastair began joining Alara for dinner more evenings than not, and though their conversations were still tentative, still shaped by years of practiced distance, they were conversations nonetheless. He asked about the garden, and she told him about the roses she had grafted herself, the lavender she had planted to draw the bees, the small stone path she had laid with her own hands over the course of 2 patient summers. He asked about the charity work Lady Pembroke had mentioned, and Alara spoke, hesitantly at first and then with growing warmth, about the orphanage in the eastern parish, the children she had come to know, the small ways she had found to help. He listened. It was perhaps the simplest and most important change of all that he finally listened. One morning in early autumn, Alastair surprised her by joining her in the garden before breakfast, his sleeves rolled up in a manner entirely unlike him. "I thought I might help," he said, somewhat awkwardly, gesturing at the bed of roses she was tending. Alara studied him for a moment, an amused smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "You don't know the first thing about roses." "No," he admitted. "But I am willing to learn, if you're willing to teach me." She handed him a small trowel, and for the next hour they worked side by side in comfortable, easy silence, broken occasionally by her patient instructions and his good-natured, if clumsy, attempts to follow them. It was a small morning, unremarkable in the grand sweep of a life, and yet it felt to both of them like something precious, something neither had quite dared to hope for. Lady Margaret, observing this quiet transformation during a brief return visit some weeks later, could not help but express her satisfaction. "I knew there was hope for you yet," she told her brother, watching through the window as Alara laughed at something he had said in the garden below. "Though I confess, I did not expect you to take my advice quite so thoroughly to heart." "She deserves far more than I have given her," Alastair said quietly. "I am only beginning to understand how much I have to make up for." "Then keep beginning," Margaret said simply. "Every day if you must. That is how these things are mended brick by brick, not all at once." He took her words to heart, and over the following months, the manor itself seemed to soften, as though the house had been holding its breath for years and had only now begun to exhale. The staff noticed it first, the warmer atmosphere at dinner, the sound of quiet laughter drifting from the study some evenings where once there had only been silence. Even the garden seemed to bloom more richly that autumn, though Alara suspected this had more to do with her own lighter heart than any change in soil or sunlight. Yet not everyone observed this quiet flourishing with pleasure. Lord Edmund Caro, who had continued his careful, sympathetic correspondence with Alara in the months following the ball, watched the growing warmth between the Duke and Duchess with mounting frustration he was careful never to let show. He had built, over nearly 2 years, a friendship with Alara founded on his apparent understanding of her loneliness, his gentle sympathy for a marriage he had characterized, subtly and repeatedly, as cold beyond repair. He had positioned himself, patiently and deliberately, as a quiet source of comfort she might one day turn to more fully. That careful positioning now seemed at risk of unraveling entirely, and Edmund was not a man accustomed to watching his plans dissolve without resistance. He arranged, with practiced casualness, to call upon Ravenscroft Manor under the pretense of discussing a shared interest in horticulture, a subject he had learned Alara cared for deeply. Alara received him politely in the drawing-room, though she noted with some surprise that her earlier eagerness for his visits had cooled considerably in recent months. "You seem well," Edmund observed, settling into a chair across from her with practiced ease. "Happier, if I may say so." "I confess I am pleased to see it, though perhaps a touch surprised." "Things have changed for the better," Alara said simply, offering little elaboration. "The Duke has taken a sudden interest in matters he long ignored, I understand," Edmund said, his tone light, almost teasing, though something sharper moved beneath the surface. "How fortunate that he should rediscover his affection so conveniently." Alara's expression cooled slightly at the implication. "It is not convenient, Edmund. It is genuine. He has been honest with me about his failings and he has worked to correct them. Of course, Edmund said smoothly, though his eyes remained watchful. I only hope, for your sake, that this newfound attention is not simply the passing enthusiasm of a man unused to giving it. Such things have a way of fading once the novelty wears thin. The comment lingered uncomfortably in the air, and though Alara said nothing further on the matter, she found herself troubled by it long after Edmund had taken his leave. She had, over the past 2 years, come to value his friendship, his sympathetic ear during her loneliest months. But something in his manner today, the careful way he had planted doubt without ever quite stating it outright, left her unsettled in a way she could not immediately name. That evening, she mentioned the visit to Alastair, choosing her words carefully. Lord Carrow called today, she said, as they sat together after dinner. He seemed troubled by the changes between us. Alastair's expression shifted, something guarded moving behind his eyes. Edmund Carrow has called upon you often, I understand, over these past 2 years. He was kind to me, Alara said, during a time when kindness was in short supply in this house. I will not pretend otherwise, nor will I apologize for accepting friendship when I needed it. I am not asking you to apologize, Alastair said, though a note of tension had crept into his voice regardless. I am only aware, from what little I know of Edmund Carrow, that his intentions are rarely as simple as they appear. Are you suggesting I have been foolish? Alara asked, a flicker of hurt entering her voice. No, Alastair said quickly, softening. I am suggesting that I failed you so completely that another man saw an opportunity where a husband should have seen his own responsibility. That failure is mine, Alara, not yours. I only hope, now that I am finally trying to be present, that it is not too late for my presence to matter more than his. Alara considered this for a long moment, the tension in her chest slowly easing. It matters, she said quietly. It matters very much. Still, the conversation left a small unease settled between them, a reminder that the fragile trust they had begun rebuilding remained new and untested, vulnerable to doubts planted by outside hands. Alastair resolved, privately, to be more attentive still, to ensure that whatever ground he had gained would not be so easily undermined. He did not yet fully understand the extent of Edmund Carrow's ambitions, nor how carefully and patiently that man had positioned himself over the past 2 years, waiting for exactly the sort of opportunity that a fragile, newly mending marriage might still provide. Weeks passed, and the warmth between Alastair and Alara continued to grow, slowly and carefully, like a garden tended with new attention after years of neglect. They took to walking together in the evenings, along the same paths Alara had built alone for so long. He learned the names of her favorite flowers. She learned, in turn, small pieces of the grief he had carried silently for years, the memory of Vivienne he had never before shared with anyone so fully. I am not asking you to forget her, Alara said gently, one evening as they walked beneath a sky heavy with stars. Only to make room, if you can, for what we might still build together. I am trying, Alastair said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. For the first time in years, I am truly trying. It was, perhaps, the most hopeful either of them had felt in longer than they could measure. And yet, even as their bond deepened, Edmund Carrow continued his quiet observations from a careful distance, patience wearing thin, his plans shifting slowly from simple opportunism toward something far more deliberate, and far more dangerous to the fragile happiness the Duke and Duchess had only just begun to build. Edmund Carrow was a patient man, but patience, he had come to believe, was only useful when paired with the willingness to act at the right moment. He had watched the Duke and Duchess grow closer for months now, watched his own carefully built friendship with Alara cool as her attention turned more fully toward her husband, and he had decided, quietly and deliberately, that the moment had come to act. He did not consider himself cruel. He told himself, as he had told himself for 2 years, that he acted out of genuine care for Alara, that a man who had truly seen her worth, who had offered her comfort when her husband offered nothing, deserved consideration she seemed increasingly unwilling to give. It was easier, he found, to frame his ambitions as devotion. It made the deception that followed feel, to him at least, almost justified. He began carefully, calling upon Ravenscroft Manor on an afternoon he knew Alastair would be present, engaging Alara in warm, familiar conversation calculated to appear, to any watching eye, more intimate than it truly was. He complimented her openly, touched her hand briefly as he said his farewells, lingered a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed. Alara noticed none of the calculation behind these small gestures, accustomed as she was to Edmund's easy warmth after 2 years of genuine friendship. Alastair, watching from the doorway of his study, noticed all of it, and felt the old, familiar tightness return to his chest, the one he had worked so hard these past months to release. He said nothing that evening, telling himself he was imagining significance where none existed. But the seed had been planted, and Edmund, watching from a careful distance, was satisfied to see it take root. Over the following 2 weeks, small things began to shift. Alastair found himself growing quieter again, watching Alara with a guardedness she recognized instantly, the same guardedness that had defined the first years of their marriage. She asked him gently what troubled him, and he offered only vague reassurances, unwilling to voice the ugly, irrational fear taking hold in his chest, the fear that he had opened himself to loss again only to find himself already losing. Edmund, meanwhile, arranged for a letter to reach Alastair's desk, one written in Alara's own hand, though the words had been carefully lifted and rearranged from an old and entirely innocent note she had sent him months before, back when their friendship had simply been a comfort during her loneliest days. Stripped of its original context and paired with a few careful additions in Edmund's own practiced hand, the letter read as something far more intimate than it had ever truly been, hinting at feelings Alara had never actually held. Alastair found the letter tucked deliberately among his correspondence one evening, left there by a servant Edmund had quietly bribed for the purpose. He read it once, twice, a third time, each reading twisting the old wound in his chest deeper. He thought of Vivienne, of the years he had spent protecting himself from exactly this kind of pain, and felt, with a sickening lurch, that he had been a fool to lower his guard at all. He did not confront Alara immediately. Instead, he withdrew, the warmth of the past months evaporating almost overnight, replaced by a cold, wounded distance that felt, to Alara, achingly familiar and entirely without explanation. "What has changed?" she asked him one evening, her voice tight with confusion and hurt after nearly a week of his renewed silence. "We were doing so well, Alastair. What happened?" "Nothing has changed," he said, though the words were clipped and unconvincing even to his own ears. "Do not lie to me," Alara said, her patience finally fraying after years of practiced restraint. "I have spent 3 years learning to read every small change in your mood, every silence, every distance. Something has happened, and I deserve to know what it is." For a long moment, Alastair said nothing, wrestling with the old instinct to simply retreat, to protect himself the way he always had. But something in her face, the raw hurt and genuine confusion there, finally broke through his defenses. "I found a letter," he said quietly, "on my desk. From you to Edmund Caro, it spoke of feelings I did not know you held for him." Alara stared at him, genuine bewilderment crossing her features. "I have never written such a letter. What did it say?" Alastair retrieved it from his desk and handed it to her without a word. Alara read it quickly, her confusion shifting rapidly to anger as she recognized fragments of an old, entirely innocent note she had written Edmund nearly a year earlier, thanking him for his kindness during a particularly lonely winter, rearranged now into something that bore only a distant resemblance to her actual words. "This has been altered," she said, her voice shaking with fury she rarely allowed herself to show. "These are pieces of an old letter, taken out of context and twisted into something else entirely. I did write to Edmund once, months ago, thanking him for his friendship during a time when I had precious little else. But this," she gestured at the paper, "this is not what I wrote. Someone has changed it." "Why would he do such a thing?" Alastair asked, though even as he spoke the question, understanding was beginning to dawn, cold and unwelcome in his chest. "Because he wanted more from our friendship than I was ever willing to give," Alara said, the pieces falling into place even as she spoke them aloud. "And because our marriage has begun to heal in ways that threaten whatever plans he had built around my loneliness." Alistair felt a wave of shame wash over him, sharp and immediate. He had let old fear override the trust they had worked so carefully to rebuild. He had believed a forged letter over the woman who had spent months proving, patiently and consistently, that she deserved his faith. "I am sorry," he said, the words feeling wholly inadequate against the weight of what he had allowed himself to believe, even briefly. "I let fear speak louder than trust. I know now how deeply that has hurt you, and I understand if you cannot easily forgive it." Alara was quiet for a long moment, her anger slowly giving way to a weary, aching sadness. "This is what frightens me most, Alistair," she said finally. "Not that you doubted me for a handful of days, though that alone was painful enough. It is that the moment fear returned, you retreated exactly as you always have, rather than simply asking me the truth. If we are to build something real between us, I need to know that fear will not always send you running back behind your walls." "It will not," Alistair said, with a firmness he hoped she could feel was genuine. "I have spent years hiding behind those walls, and I have only just begun to understand how much they have cost me, and cost you. I do not intend to retreat into them again, not over this, not over anything." Alara studied him carefully, searching for the sincerity she needed to see, and found it, however imperfectly, in the earnestness of his expression. "Then we will face this together," she said finally. "But Edmund Caro must be dealt with. He has crossed a line that cannot simply be forgiven or ignored." They resolved that evening to confront Edmund directly, to expose his deception and end, once and for all, whatever ambitions he had quietly nursed regarding Alara's marriage. But even as they made this resolution together, united in purpose for perhaps the first time in their marriage, neither of them yet understood how far Edmund Caro was prepared to go to protect the careful plans he had spent nearly 2 years constructing, nor how close they were about to come to losing everything they had only just begun to rebuild. 2 days later, Alistair called upon Edmund directly at his townhouse in the county seat, the forged letter in hand, his expression carefully controlled despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. Edmund received him with practiced calm, though a flicker of unease crossed his features when he saw the letter in Alistair's grip. "Your Grace," he said smoothly, "to what do I owe this visit?" "You know precisely why I have come," Alistair said, setting the altered letter on the table between them. "You forged this, Edmund, twisted my wife's innocent words into something they were never meant to be, and delivered it to my desk with the clear intention of destroying the trust we had only just begun to rebuild. I want to know why." Edmund's composure slipped, just slightly, before he recovered it with visible effort. "I only wish to ensure that Alara's happiness was genuinely considered," he said carefully. "You neglected her for 3 years, Your Grace. Forgive me if I found it difficult to trust that your sudden change of heart would prove lasting." "That is not your judgment to make," Alistair said, his voice hard. "And whatever failings I have shown as a husband, they do not grant you license to deceive and manipulate a woman who trusted you as a friend. I want your word that you will not contact her again, and I want to know if this letter is the only deception you have arranged, or if there are others waiting to surface." Edmund's jaw tightened, calculation moving visibly behind his eyes as he weighed his options. For a long moment, the room held tense and silent, the fate of whatever plans he had built hanging precariously in the balance. "There is nothing else," Edmund said finally, though something in his tone left Alistair unconvinced. "You have my word, Your Grace. I will trouble your household no further." Alistair studied him carefully, uncertain whether to believe the assurance, but with no further evidence to press the matter, he took his leave, the forged letter still clutched in his hand, a small but troubling unease settling in his chest that he could not quite shake. He did not yet know that Edmund Caro, cornered and humiliated, was already turning his mind toward a far more desperate and dangerous plan. one that would, within a matter of weeks, threaten to unravel everything the Duke and Duchess had worked so carefully to rebuild. Edmund Caro did not accept defeat easily, and in the days following his confrontation with Alastair, he turned his considerable cunning toward a plan far more desperate than anything he had attempted before. He told himself, as he always did, that necessity justified the method, that a man who had waited 2 years for an opportunity could not simply abandon his ambitions over one setback. He knew Alara's schedule well from months of careful observation. He knew she still walked alone in her garden most mornings before the household fully woke, a private ritual she had maintained even through the recent turmoil. He knew, too, that Alastair had recently taken to rising early himself, eager to join her, a small habit born of the trust they had worked so hard to rebuild. Edmund arranged, through a servant he had bribed weeks before, to have a note delivered to Alara that appeared to come from a woman she had befriended through her charity work at the Eastern Parish Orphanage, requesting an urgent private meeting near the old stone bridge at the edge of the Ravenscroft property regarding a matter concerning one of the children. Alara, ever generous with her time and concern, did not hesitate to respond, slipping quietly from the house before dawn to meet what she believed was a friend in need. She found Edmund waiting instead, alone on the bridge in the pale gray light of early morning. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice sharp with immediate suspicion. "Where is Mrs. Ellery?" "The note said she needed to speak with me about the orphanage." "There is no urgent matter with the orphanage," Edmund said, stepping closer despite the clear tension in her posture. "I needed to speak with you myself, and I did not believe you would come if I asked plainly." "You had no right to deceive me this way," Alara said, backing a step away from him, her earlier warmth toward him now entirely extinguished. "Whatever you wish to say it quickly and then leave me be. I have nothing further to discuss with you after what you did." "I only wish to tell you," Edmund said, his voice taking on an edge of desperation he could not fully conceal, "that whatever warmth you believe has returned to your marriage will not last. Alastair Ravenscroft spent 3 years proving exactly the kind of husband he is. A few months of attention cannot undo that so easily, and when the novelty fades, as it will, you will remember that I was the one who truly saw your worth." "You forged a letter to destroy my marriage," Alara said, her voice trembling now with anger rather than fear. "You have shown me exactly what kind of man you are, Edmund, and it is not one whose judgment I have any reason to trust." At that precise moment, drawn by an instinct he could not quite name, Alastair arrived at the edge of the garden, having risen early to join Alara for their now customary morning walk. He stopped short at the sight before him, Alara and Edmund standing close together near the stone bridge in the pale morning light, their voices raised in what, from a distance and without context, appeared to be an intimate and heated exchange. The old wound, the one he had believed himself finally free of, tore open with sudden, devastating force. "Alara," he called out, his voice carrying across the garden with a coldness that startled even him. She turned immediately, relief flooding her features at his arrival. "Alastair, thank goodness. This man tricked me into coming here with a false message about the orphanage. He has been saying the most." "I saw enough," Alastair said, his voice clipped and hard, the old fear rising up faster than reason could contain it. "I saw you standing here together, at dawn, in secret, after everything he has already done to deceive this family once. Forgive me if I find your explanation difficult to accept so readily." The unfairness of the accusation struck Alara like a physical blow. "You cannot possibly believe I arranged this," she said, disbelief and hurt warring plainly across her face. "I came here believing I was helping a friend from the orphanage. He deceived me exactly as he deceived you with that letter. I am the injured party here, Alastair, not the architect of some scheme against you." But the years of practiced self-protection, the old walls Alastair had spent a lifetime building around the wound Vivienne's loss had left in him, rose up faster and more powerfully than his better judgment could restrain. Standing in the cold morning light, seeing his wife once again in close proximity to the man who had already once betrayed his trust. He could not, in that raw and unthinking moment, separate reasonable doubt from irrational fear. "I want to believe you," he said, his voice tight with a pain he could not fully articulate. "I am trying to believe you. But I have been made a fool once already by this man's deception, and I find myself unable to simply trust that this is not, in some way, connected." "Then you do not trust me at all," Alara said quietly, the words landing with a devastating finality. "Not truly. Not the way a husband should trust his wife. Everything these past months, the garden, the dinners, the dancing, all of it meant nothing if it can be undone so easily by a single misunderstanding." "That is not fair," Alistair said, though even as he spoke the words he heard how hollow they sounded. "No," Alara agreed, her voice steady now despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "It is not fair. None of this has ever been fair to me, Alistair. 3 years of silence, 3 years of being invisible in my own home, and now, the moment I have finally allowed myself to hope again, the first shadow of doubt sends you retreating back into exactly the man you always were. I cannot keep rebuilding something that collapses every time it is tested." Edmund, watching this unraveling with something between satisfaction and genuine alarm at how far the confrontation had escalated, opened his mouth as if to intervene, to clarify the truth of his own deception. But the damage between husband and wife had already taken root too deeply for his words to matter now. "I am sorry," Alistair said, the anger draining from his voice as quickly as it had risen, replaced by a dawning, horrified realization of what he had just done. "Alara, please," I spoke without thinking. "I know you did not arrange this. I know Edmund deceived you exactly as he deceived me. I let old fear speak before I let myself truly see what was in front of me." But the words came too late. Alara had already turned away, walking back toward the manor with quiet, controlled steps, leaving Alistair standing alone at the edge of the garden he had only recently learned to love, the weight of his own failure settling over him like a physical thing. She did not speak to him for the remainder of that day. He tried, repeatedly, to find the words that might undo the damage of that single, devastating morning, but each attempt seemed to land against a wall of quiet, controlled grief that no apology seemed capable of penetrating. By evening, Alara had retreated to her room, and Alistair, uncertain what else to offer, retreated once more to his study, the familiar silence of the house pressing in around him with a weight it had not carried in months. He did not know, as he sat alone before the dying fire that evening, that Alara had spent the afternoon not merely grieving but deciding. 3 years of quiet loneliness, months of fragile hope, and now, in a single unguarded moment, proof that the old fear still lived close beneath the surface of her husband's newfound warmth, ready to resurface at the first sign of difficulty. She could not, she had decided with a clarity that felt both devastating and strangely calm, continue building a life on ground this unstable. Near midnight, with the household fully asleep and the manor wrapped in silence, Alara rose from her bed, dressed quietly, and gathered a small case she had packed with quiet, deliberate care throughout the long hours of that difficult afternoon. She moved through the familiar halls of Ravenscroft one final time, pausing briefly at the window that overlooked her garden, now shrouded in darkness, before continuing toward the front entrance. She left a single letter on Alistair's desk, sealed simply with her name, before slipping out into the cold night air and disappearing down the long drive toward the road beyond, leaving behind the only home she had known for 3 years, and the man whose heart, she realized with quiet, aching certainty, she was taking with her whether he yet understood it or not. Alistair found the letter the following morning, still seated at his desk where he had fallen asleep sometime in the small hours, exhausted from a night spent turning over every possible way to make things right. His hand trembled as he broke the seal, and as he read her words, carefully written and utterly without bitterness, the full weight of what he had lost and what he had failed to protect crashed over him at once, more completely and more painfully than anything he had felt in the 6 long years since Vivienne's death. The house, when he finally looked up from the letter, had never felt so entirely, unbearably silent. The letter was short, far shorter than the years of feeling it summarized. Alistair, it began, I have spent 3 years learning to survive in a marriage that gave me a home but never a husband. These past months gave me hope that things had truly changed, and for that hope, however briefly held, I am grateful. But yesterday morning showed me that the fear which has always stood between us has not truly left, only softened for a while. I cannot spend the rest of my life waiting to discover, again and again, whether that fear will return whenever things become difficult. I have gone to my aunt's home in the north to consider what I wish my life to become. Please do not follow me there seeking to change my mind through words alone. If anything is to be repaired between us, it must be through more than apology. Alara. Alistair read the letter perhaps a dozen times that morning, each reading settling the weight of it deeper into his chest. He did not summon the staff immediately, did not send for his sister or call for a carriage in the desperate, thoughtless way some part of him wanted to. Instead, he sat alone in his study for nearly an hour, the letter held loosely in his hands, forcing himself to sit with the full and uncomfortable truth of what he had done. He thought of Vivienne, as he so often did, but for the first time in 6 years, the memory did not simply summon grief. It summoned clarity. He had spent 6 years building walls to ensure he would never again feel the particular devastation of losing someone he loved. In doing so, he had failed to notice that he was causing another kind of devastation entirely, a slow, quiet, accumulating loss inflicted not by death, but by his own persistent absence. He had protected himself so thoroughly from one kind of pain that he had inflicted years of a different, equally real pain upon the one person who had never stopped trying to reach him. And when Edmund Caro's scheme had finally tested the fragile trust they had built, Alistair had proven, in a single devastating moment, that his walls had never truly come down at all. He had simply learned to hide them better. He rose from his desk finally and made his way to the garden, the place that had first shown him who his wife truly was. The roses still bloomed there, though somehow their color seemed dimmed in the gray autumn light, and the small stone bench beneath the old oak tree sat empty in a way that felt, for the first time, genuinely wrong. He sat there for a long while, turning over every conversation, every quiet dinner, every small act of trust Alara had extended to him in recent months, and understood with growing, painful clarity exactly what he had thrown away in a single unguarded moment of old fear. Lady Margaret arrived 2 days later, summoned by an urgent letter from the household staff, who had grown genuinely worried watching their Duke wander the halls of Ravenscroft like a man only half present in his own life. "You look terrible," Margaret said bluntly, finding him once again in the garden, staring at nothing in particular. "She is gone," Alistair said simply. "To her aunt's home in the north. I let fear speak before I let myself trust her, Margaret. Edmund Caro set a trap, and I walked directly into it. And in doing so, I proved to her that everything we had rebuilt could collapse the moment it was truly tested." Margaret listened as he recounted the entire painful sequence, the forged letter, the confrontation with Edmund, the devastating morning at the stone bridge, and finally the letter left on his desk in the dead of night. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, studying her brother with an expression that held more sympathy than judgment, though plenty of both remained. "You have made a grave mistake," she said finally, "but it is not, I think, an unforgivable one, provided you understand exactly what must change now. Alara did not leave because you doubted her for a single unguarded moment. People make mistakes, even people trying genuinely to do better. She left because that moment revealed the walls you have never fully dismantled, only hidden more carefully. If you wish to win her back, apology will not be enough. You must show her, through actions sustained over time, that those walls are truly gone, not simply better disguised." "How do I do that?" Alistair asked, "when she has asked me explicitly not to follow her?" "You respect that request," Margaret said firmly. "For now, you give her the space she has asked for, and you use that time to prove to yourself, honestly, whether you are capable of the change you claim to want. Not for her sake alone, but for your own. And when the time comes that she is ready to hear from you, and it will come, though perhaps not as quickly as you wish. You make certain that what you offer her is not simply another apology, but genuine, demonstrated change." Alistair absorbed his sister's words in heavy silence, recognizing the truth in them even as they cost him considerable effort to accept. He wanted desperately to ride north immediately, to find Alara and beg her forgiveness in person, to fix the damage through sheer force of will and words. But he understood, with a clarity that felt hard-won, that such an approach would only prove her worst fear correct, that he acted from panic and fear rather than genuine understanding. In the weeks that followed, Alistair began the slow, difficult work of confronting the grief he had spent 6 years avoiding. He sought out a physician known for treating afflictions of the mind and heart alike, a relatively unusual step for a man of his station, and began the uncomfortable process of speaking openly, for the first time, about Vivienne's death and the walls he had built in its aftermath. He wrote letters, not to Alara, but to himself, working through years of buried feeling with a discipline he had never before applied to his own emotional life. He also, quietly and without fanfare, ensured that Edmund Caro's deceptions became known throughout the county, not through cruelty or public humiliation, but through careful, factual conversations with those whose good opinion mattered to Edmund most. Within a matter of weeks, Edmund found himself increasingly excluded from the social circles he had once moved through with ease, the consequences of his scheming finally catching up to him in ways that offered Alistair a measure of quiet, if incomplete, satisfaction. He tended the garden himself in Alara's absence, clumsily at first, consulting the household gardener for guidance, determined that when Alara returned, if she returned, she would find the place she loved not withered from neglect, but carefully, if imperfectly, maintained in her honor. He wrote to her only once during those difficult weeks, a short letter that made no demands and asked for nothing beyond her well-being. "I am using this time as you asked," he wrote, "not to convince you of anything, but to become someone worth reconsidering. The garden is well. I have learned with some difficulty that lavender requires far more patience than I initially assumed. I hope you are finding peace. Whenever and if ever you are ready, I will be here, working to become the husband I should have been from the beginning." Alara did not respond immediately, and Alistair did not press for a reply, honoring the space she had requested even as each passing day tested his patience and his hope in equal measure. Nearly 2 months after she had left, as autumn deepened toward winter and the garden's roses finally surrendered to the season's first hard frost, a letter arrived at Ravenscroft Manor bearing Alara's familiar handwriting. Alistair's hands trembled as he broke the seal, uncertain whether the words within would offer hope or finality, but certain, regardless of what he found, that he had done everything within his power these past 2 months to become a man deserving of whatever answer she had chosen to give. Alistair, the letter began, "I have spent these 2 months in quiet reflection, surrounded by my aunt's kindness and the particular clarity that distance sometimes provides. I have thought of little else besides our marriage, its long years of silence, and the brief months of warmth that followed. I have asked myself, many times over, whether that warmth was real, or whether it was simply the natural result of a house too long accustomed to loneliness suddenly offered a taste of something better. I have decided, after much consideration, that I do believe it was real. I believe you meant every word you offered me during those months, even if fear proved, in one difficult moment, stronger than the trust we had only just begun to build. I do not say this to excuse what happened at the bridge, nor to pretend that moment did not cause genuine harm. But I have come to understand, through my own quiet reflection, that people who are truly trying to change do not always succeed perfectly on the first attempt. What matters, I think, is not whether a person stumbles, but whether they rise afterward with genuine commitment to doing better. I received your letter about the lavender, and I confess it made me smile for the first time in weeks. I would like to see the garden again. I would like to see you again, though I ask that we take this slowly, with honesty as our guide rather than urgency. I will return to Ravenscroft at the end of this month if you are still willing to have me. Alara. Alistair read the letter 3 times before he trusted himself to fully believe its contents, and when he finally did, something in his chest that had remained tightly wound for 2 long months finally began, cautiously, to loosen. He wrote back immediately, though he took care with every word, wanting his reply to reflect the steady, considered change he had worked to build rather than the desperate relief flooding through him. The final week of that month passed slowly for Alistair, each day bringing its own mixture of hope and nervous anticipation. He spent the time finishing the garden's preparations for winter, ensuring the roses were properly protected against the coming frost, the lavender trimmed and readied for the cold months ahead. He rehearsed, though he ultimately abandoned, several versions of what he might say when Alara finally arrived, deciding in the end that honesty, offered simply and without elaborate preparation, would serve them both better than any carefully crafted speech. On the appointed day, Alara's carriage arrived at Ravenscroft Manor beneath a pale, clear winter sky, the first snow of the season dusting the grounds in a thin, delicate layer of white. Alistair stood waiting at the entrance, having dismissed the staff's offer to greet her formally, wanting this moment to belong entirely to the two of them. Alara stepped down from the carriage, and for a long moment they simply looked at one another across the short distance of the drive, 2 months of separation and years of accumulated history passing silently between them. "You came," Alistair said finally, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer felt any need to hide. "I said I would," Alara replied, a small cautious smile touching her lips. "How was your journey?" "Long," she admitted, "but it gave me time to think clearly about what I wanted to say to you." "I have thought of little else these 2 months besides what I wanted to say to you as well," Alistair said, closing the distance between them slowly. "But I find, now that you are here, that I would rather show you than simply tell you. Will you walk with me?" They walked together toward the garden, the winter air crisp and clean around them, their steps falling naturally into the same easy rhythm they had discovered together months before. The roses stood bare now, pruned carefully for the season, but the bones of the garden remained, sturdy and well-tended, proof of the care Alistair had continued to offer even in her absence. "You kept it well," Alara said softly, running her fingers along the frost-touched branches of a rose bush near the garden's entrance. "I promised myself I would," Alistair said, "not to convince you of anything, but because I finally understood what this garden represents. Everything you built here, quietly, patiently, without waiting for anyone's permission or attention. I wanted, at the very least, to prove I was capable of tending something with the same patience you have always shown, even if it took me far too long to learn it." They walked in comfortable silence for a while longer before settling onto the small stone bench beneath the old oak tree, its branches now bare against the pale winter sky. "I spent these 2 months speaking with a physician about Vivienne," Alistair said quietly, the admission still somewhat difficult to voice aloud, though far less so than it would have been months earlier. "About the walls I built after her death, and how thoroughly they came to define every part of my life, including, most painfully, my marriage to you. I understand now, in a way I did not fully understand before, that protecting myself from one kind of loss caused me to inflict an entirely different kind of loss upon you, for years, without ever truly seeing it. I know that was not easy for you to face," Alara said gently. "It was not," he agreed. "But it was necessary, and I am grateful, in a strange way, that the difficulty at the bridge forced me to finally confront what I had spent 6 years avoiding. I cannot promise you perfection, Alara. I cannot promise that fear will never again try to speak louder than trust. But I can promise you that I now understand the difference, and that I am committed, every day, to choosing trust deliberately, rather than allowing fear to choose for me by default." Alara studied him carefully, searching his face for the sincerity she needed to see, and found it steady and unmistakable in the earnestness of his expression. "I do not need perfection," she said finally. "I have never needed that. What I needed, what I still need, is a partner who chooses me deliberately, again and again, especially in the difficult moments, rather than retreating whenever things become uncertain. If you can offer me that, genuinely and consistently, then I believe we can build something real together, something stronger than what we had before. I can offer you that, Alistair said, taking her hand gently in his own. I intend to spend the rest of my life proving it, for as long as you are willing to let me try. Alara smiled, genuine and warm, and for the first time in the 3 long years of their marriage, Alistair felt something settle fully into place between them. A foundation built not on silence or convenient distance, but on honesty, patience, and a willingness, finally and completely, to truly see one another. They sat together in the winter garden as the pale sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, two people who had nearly lost everything before finally learning how to hold on to it properly. And as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky above Ravenscroft Manor, Alistair understood, with a certainty that felt entirely new, that the heart Alara had taken with her that difficult night 2 months before had, in truth, always belonged to her. It had simply taken him far too long, and far too much pain, to finally understand it completely. From that evening forward, the halls of Ravenscroft Manor were never quite so silent again. 2 years passed at Ravenscroft Manor, and the house that had once known only silence now rarely fell quiet at all. The change had not come without effort. Alistair continued his conversations with the physician for the better part of a year, working slowly through the grief and fear that had shaped so much of his early life. Alara, for her part, remained patient but honest, never allowing old wounds to be papered over with easy comfort, insisting always that whatever they built together be built on solid ground rather than convenient forgetting. It was, both of them agreed in quieter moments, harder work than either had expected marriage to require, and infinitely more rewarding than either had believed possible during those first 3 silent years. The garden had grown beyond even Alara's original design, expanded now to include a small orchard Alistair had planted himself during their second spring together. Apple and pear trees he tended, with the same clumsy determination he had once brought to his early lessons among the roses. He had grown considerably more skilled with a trowel in the years since, though Alara still teased him gently about the crooked row of lavender he had planted during that first difficult autumn, insisting she would never allow him to straighten it, a small, imperfect monument to the beginning of his change. Lord Edmund Carow, whose schemes had once threatened to unravel everything, found his standing in the county diminished considerably in the years that followed his exposure. Without the social connections his reputation had once afforded him, his ambitions withered along with his influence, and he eventually withdrew from the county entirely, relocating to a distant relations estate in a part of the country where his history was not yet known. Neither Alistair nor Alara spent much time thinking of him after that, having long since decided that his schemes, however painful in their consequences, had ultimately served to reveal truths about their marriage that might otherwise have remained hidden far longer. In the spring of their second year of true partnership, Alara discovered she was expecting their first child, news that filled Ravenscroft Manor with a fresh, nervous joy neither of them had quite anticipated. Alistair, who had spent so many years guarding himself against attachment for fear of loss, found himself confronting those old fears once more, though this time he did not retreat into silence. Instead, he spoke openly with Alara about his anxieties, and together they faced them, a pattern that had become, by then, the genuine foundation of their marriage. Their daughter was born on a cold morning in early winter, nearly exactly 2 years after the difficult night Alara had once left Ravenscroft in the dark. They named her Vivienne Margaret, a choice that had required considerable conversation between them before Alara finally suggested it herself, understanding that honoring the woman who had shaped so much of Alistair's early grief was not a betrayal of their own love, but rather a way of finally making peace with a painful chapter that no longer needed to be hidden or feared. Lady Margaret, upon hearing the child's name, wept openly for the first time in anyone's memory, declaring the gesture the truest proof, yet that her brother had finally healed the wounds she had watched him carry for so many years. The household staff, who had witnessed the long, difficult years of silence, and the fragile, hopeful months of reconciliation that followed, took particular delight in the new sounds that filled the manor's halls. A baby's laughter drifting through corridors that had once known only quiet footsteps and careful, guarded conversation. Hannah, the young maid who had once gently observed to Alara that no wife should eat alone in her own home, now often could be found rocking young Vivienne to sleep in the nursery, having remained in service to the family through all the years of change. Alara continued her charity work at the Eastern Parish Orphanage throughout these years, and Alastair, rather than remaining distant from these efforts as he once might have, took an active interest, eventually funding the construction of a new schoolhouse for the children in her care, a project they oversaw together during long afternoons spent reviewing plans and discussing lessons with the same patient collaboration they had learned to bring to every part of their shared life. Their marriage was not without its ordinary difficulties in the years that followed, disagreements over household matters, occasional misunderstandings that required honest, sometimes uncomfortable conversation to resolve, the natural friction of two people building a life together after so many years of practiced distance. But these difficulties bore little resemblance to the silent, aching loneliness that had once defined their union. They argued when they argued, as partners who trusted one another enough to disagree openly, rather than retreating into the careful, wounded silence that had once been their only language. On the 3rd anniversary of Alara's return to Ravenscroft, Alastair surprised her with a small, private ceremony in the garden they had built and rebuilt together, a renewal of the vows they had first exchanged as near strangers so many years before. This time, standing among the roses in the golden light of late summer, their young daughter held in Margaret's arms nearby, they spoke their promises to one another with a depth of understanding that had been entirely absent from their first, formal exchange of vows. "I promise," Alastair said, holding Alara's hands in his own, "to choose you deliberately every day, especially in the difficult moments. I promise never again to let fear speak louder than trust between us." "I promise," Alara replied, her eyes bright with emotion, "to continue building this life alongside you, not despite our difficult beginning, but strengthened by everything we have learned from it. I promise to always tell you the truth, even when it is difficult, because I have learned that honesty, however uncomfortable, is the only foundation strong enough to hold what we are building together." As the sun set over Ravenscroft Manor that evening, casting long golden shadows across the garden that had once been the only place in the house where Alara felt truly herself, both of them understood how far they had traveled from those first 3 silent years. The Duke, who had once ignored his quiet wife for years, had in the end learned to see her fully, not because circumstance forced his hand, but because he had finally done the difficult, necessary work of understanding himself well enough to offer her the partnership she had always deserved. And Alara, who had once built an entire private world within the walls of a marriage that offered her so little, had learned that leaving, on that difficult winter night 2 years before, had not been an ending after all, but rather the beginning of a love finally built on honesty rather than convenient silence, patience rather than practiced distance, and a partnership strong enough to weather whatever difficulties still lay ahead of them. The garden bloomed richly that summer, roses climbing higher along the old stone walls than they ever had before, lavender filling the evening air with its familiar, comforting scent, and somewhere within the walls of Ravenscroft Manor, laughter, real and unguarded, echoed through halls that had once known only silence, a sound that neither Alastair nor Alara ever again took for granted.